It's my staff's understanding that 2 and 3 have similar problems. Is that your understanding?
Yes, there are similar problems with the tubes. The tubes in 3 had more problems, more significant damage than the tubes in 2.
But is your understanding they have similar problems?
Yes.
I'm assuming, because the rumors that we're hearing is that they plan to start up in October, but you haven't even gotten the letter back.
No, that's not correct.
So you can say unequivocally that Unit 2 is not going to be restarted by October.
Oh, yes, absolutely. When we receive, let me explain the process. When we receive that letter from them, then it will take us some time. I can't tell you how long. It will be longer than days and weeks. It will be on the order of months to understand whether they have understood well enough the root causes of the problem and to understand whether what their plan forward is, if it is going to provide the adequate safety. We will not let this plant start up unless we are absolutely convinced that it is safe to operate. Let me please assure you.
Well, that is music to the ears of the people in California, and I'm very appreciative. Is there any dissension from that by commissioners? Well, that's very important. Also, the Committee to Bridge the Gap did a report on San Onofre, and they're very concerned, and I'm going to again ask you if each of you will commit to me to review this report, and after you read it, would you be willing to please meet with my staff so that we can discuss it? Because they go into, this isn't rhetoric, this is page after page of specific worries. Can I get a reading from you all? Would you be willing to meet with my staff after looking at this? That is very good. Very good. Thank you for that.
All right, Mr. Dan Hirsch.
I have 2 questions, and I would like to preface it by trying to say what I think many people here are feeling. There is tremendous skepticism on the part of many of us about both Edison and the NRC and their very cozy parent relationship. So those are the 2 questions. Will you permit an adjudicatory evidentiary hearing on the safety of restart before making that decision?
All right.
Secondly, how many bad tubes are there in total?
Tonight is the augmented inspection team exit meeting. I think if you've been watching the NRC at all over the years, you understand our processes. You might even know them better than I do, for all I know. But you know that the inspection process does not provide opportunity for hearing. I'm not defending that. I'm just being straightforward with you to let you know that is the process we're in, and we do intend to follow our processes. So I just don't know the answer to it tonight. But the inspection process does not send us there.
Just one quick comment. Elmo, you're regional administrator for the region in which San Onofre exists. Here's a large number of people you're speaking before. All you have to do is say you'll go back to your superiors and recommend that there be a full evidentiary hearing. Will you do that?
I have been back to my superiors, and with this question, and we are in collaboration on whether or not such a hearing is possible. So, thank you.
All right. That's okay.
The day before yesterday, Southern California Edison, the operators of the San Onofre nuclear power plant in Southern California, released a request to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to be permitted to restart the damaged Unit 2 reactors at San Onofre. That reactor has been down since January, along with its sister, Unit 3. And both of them are severely crippled by damage to their steam generators. I'm going to explain to you what those steam generators are and why they matter, and why the request to restart the reactors without repairing or replacing those steam generators matters so much. So to begin with, I want to explain a little bit about San Onofre and the significance of steam generators, show you then how much damage has occurred in those steam generators, how that compares with the national experience, and why moving forward on approving a restart request without holding an evidentiary hearing to determine if it's safe and without fixing the problem could be very, very dangerous. So I'm going to show you a few diagrams and a few graphs. They'll be very simple, but they are designed to help us get a feel for how much radioactivity is inside these reactors and what the consequences could be if something goes wrong, and why the steam generator is important for preventing something from going wrong. So you all have driven, or most of you have driven by San Onofre. You know it's very close to the highway. There are two containment domes for the two reactors that are still operating, another containment structure nearby for a third reactor that was shut down years ago. Inside each of those reactors, there is about 1,000 times the long-lived radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb. And in the irradiated nuclear fuel pools that are between those two reactors, there's about 10 times as much as that. So the amount of radioactivity that exists at San Onofre, somewhere between Los Angeles and San Diego, is much more than the amount of radioactivity that was released from 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. The amount available for release is just astronomical. When either of those two reactors is operating, there's about 15 billion curies of radioactivity inside them. You don't need to know exactly what a curie is. Some of you will remember that it's the amount of radioactivity that will produce 37 billion radioactive disintegrations a second. So you've got 15 billion curies, and each one of those curies is producing 37 billion disintegrations that's producing radiation per second. Put differently, we measure permissible concentrations of radioactivity in the environment in picocuries. That's millionths of a millionth of a curie. So radiation is so dangerous that we have to protect people from millionths of a millionth of a curie, but there are 15 billion curies inside each of those reactors. That radioactivity is not merely giving off radioactive energy, it's also giving off thermal energy, heat. And one of the great ironies of a nuclear reactor is that you can't really turn it completely off. If you scram it, if you try to shut it down, still about 7% of the heat that it was producing when it was fully operating continues to be produced. And that's enough to cause the fuel to melt. And if the fuel melts, a large amount of that radioactivity can be released. So to put that in perspective, in the early 1980s, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission estimated for San Onofre that if there were a major accident at one of those reactors, it could result in 130,000 immediate deaths, what we call prompt fatalities, people who get radiation sickness of the sort that people at Nagasaki and Hiroshima did in the days right after the bombings and die within days or weeks. 130,000 immediate deaths, plus 300,000 cancers, latent effects that occur some years or decades afterwards, and 600,000 genetic effects in subsequent generations for approximately 1 million casualties. Now, those aren't my numbers. Those are the numbers from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission from 3 decades ago. And in those 3 decades, the population around San Onofre has greatly increased, so the consequences would be even larger. And the official risk estimates for radiation-producing cancer have also increased. Now, there are lots of accidents where you would have nowhere near that many casualties. There are lots of kinds of accidents there would be no casualties. But there's enough radioactivity inside just one reactor that if things went badly wrong, you could end up with 1 million casualties or more. If something went badly wrong with the spent fuel pool, which has 10 times as much radioactivity, long-lived radioactivity, as the reactors themselves, you could have even larger consequences. And so it is absolutely essential for a nuclear reactor to continue to cool its fuel. The great fear you have is the cooling stops. And that brings us to the steam generators. So what you see in back of you, in back of me, in front of you, is a schematic of a pressurized water reactor. So the reactor itself is in this area. The water is kept at pressure so it doesn't boil, so you can get to higher temperatures than you would normally get to before it would boil, so it remains liquid. And then that primary coolant, which is radioactive, remember it's running across the nuclear fuel, and there's always some leakage from that fuel, and in an accident there can be a lot. But that primary coolant runs from the core into a steam generator and back into the reactor. I'll show you a better drawing of a steam generator in a moment, but I wanted you to see two salient facts. One is that the steam generator takes the secondary coolant out of the containment structure to have its steam turn the turbine, run the generator to produce electricity. It gets recondensed, goes back in, produces a cycle. So you've got two problems very visible to you. One is that the steam generators are a direct pathway outside containment. So if there is a release of radioactivity, it can get into the environment. And the second is that it requires the steam generators to work in order to keep cooling the core and prevent melting. Now, they're backup systems. But what we've seen at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, and many other places is that backup systems also fail. You can have a common mode failure where an earthquake takes down both your offsite power and your backup diesels. You can have a engineering error like at Browns Ferry where you ran your primary cables and your backup cables through the same cable splitting room and they both caught fire. So there are backup systems and one hopes they'll work. But you don't want to rely on backup systems. You want the primary way of cooling the reactor, which are these steam generators, to function. The other thing that you need to know about the steam generators is the way they work is they have very, very thin tubes. They have to be thin to transfer the heat. They have to be strong enough to prevent them from bursting and having the radioactivity release and lose coolant. And those are competing factors. On the one hand, very thin. On the other hand, you need them to be very strong. So you don't want them to get damaged. They have to function well. So San Onofre was built with an original set of steam generators. They were supposed to last 40 years. And for that reason, they were supposed to last as long as the reactor. They didn't build a hatch into the containment structure. That dome has no way in for anything big because they thought they would never have to bring anything big in or out. There are smaller doorways, but no big enough hatch to take in a huge steam generator. So after about 20 years of operating, San Onofre's operators discovered that the steam generators were failing sooner than they had thought, sooner than they planned, and they were going to need to replace them. And so they replaced them, unfortunately, with steam generators that were not identical to the steam generators they'd had before. They brought in a new manufacturer, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries from Japan. They used a new alloy called Inconel 690, which has some nice characteristics in that it reduces the risk of what's called corrosion stress cracking, but at the same time it transfers heat less well. So they made it to make the tubes thinner. They had to add 400 additional tubes. They took out a stay cylinder. They made a bunch of other design changes. And here's where what seems to be just science gets mixed with the human factor of what's gone wrong within the nuclear industry from day one and within the regulator. Edison decided to cut a corner. It didn't want to have to request an amendment to its license to be able to put in these new steam generators, because that would require a higher level of review by the NRC, and the NRC might find a problem with the new steam generators, or you might request a hearing, because under the Atomic Energy Act, you have a right to an evidentiary hearing on a license amendment. So to bypass that, they told the NRC that they were making a like-for-like change, for which no license amendment should be required. They said, I've got a 100-watt GE light bulb. I'm going to replace it with a 100-watt GE light bulb. There's no reason to have a license amendment. It's identical. But they're a very proud industry. At the same time, they published an article in an industry magazine called Nuclear Engineering International that boasted of all of the changes they had made. Okay. A human thing that institutions do, cutting corners. NRC let them do it. Edison did it. They had to cut huge holes into the containment structures to put the new steam generators in. Remember, a containment structure is designed to prevent leakage in an accident. It's something you really don't want to keep cutting holes in. In fact, there's a reactor back east where they did the same thing, and the containment is now cracking from the places where they cut it. So you don't want to do it, but they did it. They put the new steam generators in, and they started to operate. And in 11 months, less than a year, Unit 3 had a burst tube. Edison told the press it's just a burst tube. There's no release of radioactivity. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, the NRC said there was a release of radioactivity. And by the way, Unit 2, which was down for maintenance, we've also discovered hundreds of bad tubes in Unit 2. Very accelerated wear. We don't know what's going on. We're going to have to try to find out what's happening. So since roughly January, both Unit 2 and Unit 3 have been shut down. Unit 2 had operated for about 22 months, less than 2 years. And here's where the story becomes a detective story. A couple days after the release of radioactivity, an NRC spokesperson told the press that in Unit 2, they had been inspecting and had found for one of the 2 steam generators, and they'd only done 80% of that steam generator, they had found that there were about 900 damaged tubes. You have to understand, this is what you might see after 40 years, not after a year or two. Well, you're all exactly like I am, inquisitive. They spent months investigating the other steam generators. What's the question you would ask? What'd you find in the other steam generators? They wouldn't tell us. We asked and asked and asked. My students ended up emailing the NRC's public information officer and asking him, could you give us the updated data? And he pretended not to understand the question the first time, hoping the student would go away. The student didn't, repeated the question, and the NRC spokesperson said, well, call me in an hour, I'd be pleased to give you the information. 50 minutes later, however, my student received an email saying, from this NRC guy, I've checked with my colleagues and we will not provide you the information. You'll have to do a Freedom of Information Act request, which can take years. So I then contacted the resident inspector for the NRC at San Onofre and asked for the data. He told me to get it from Edison. I said, Edison's a private company. You're a public agency. This is public information. Surely you must have it. Please give it to me. To which he responded by email, yes, I have the information, but no, I won't give it to you. Well, you all have watched mystery stories, right? When there's something people don't want to tell you, there's usually something reason you ought to get that information. So we kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And eventually at a hearing, or not a hearing, a public meeting at the NRC, when there was a question and answer period, I kept my hand up so long that the blood rushed to my toes. They eventually reluctantly called on me, and I asked, and we have footage of it actually from 2 of our filmmakers here, how many bad tubes? How many bad tubes? And they wouldn't answer. The NRC said, we don't know, we don't have those figures. I said, Edison has just said there are only 2 bad tubes in Unit 2. Is that true? Or is it 2,000? I don't care if it's 1,972. Is it 2 or is it 2,000? And which range? They wouldn't answer. And eventually a man from Edison, seeing that the whole audience was getting upset that something was being hidden, got up and said, well, we will release in the next day or 2 and put on the web the answer to your question, Mr. Hirsch. But in round numbers, we have 12% of the tubes in Unit 2 and 9% of the tubes in Unit 3 have more than 10% wear. Those are extraordinary numbers for new steam generators. They didn't put it up on the web that week. They didn't put it up on the web the next week or the next week or the next week. It took Senator Boxer's intervention before they were finally released. And I want to show you those data. And I want you to know that this would not have been released were it not for some students at UC Santa Cruz. So here are some numbers. I don't know if you can read them, but the numbers are astonishing. We have these 2 steam generators in each of the reactors. And so there are 734 tubes that have been damaged in one of them and 861 in another. Worse than that, they have thousands of indications of wear on the tubes. In other words, some of the tubes are damaged in 2, 3, or 4 locations. Thousands of indications of wear on 1,600 tubes. It's amazing. Look at the next chart. This is for Unit 3. Those numbers are not much different in terms of the numbers of tubes damaged, a total of about 1,800 tubes damaged, somewhat more indications of wear, and you'll notice that there are different kinds of wear: anti-vibration bar, tube support wear, tube-to-tube wear. There were a few hundred tube-to-tube indications in Unit 3 and only 2 in Unit 2. But you'll notice that there are thousands of indications of tube to anti-vibration bar and tube to tube support. This is significant because, I'm going to go back a step, this is what the steam generator looks like. There is the tubes, the primary water comes up through these tubes, comes back down through this U-bend, and there are here these anti-vibration bars. There are retainer bars, and then there are a whole bunch of plates that the tubes go through. So you can have wear of tubes running against tubes, wear of a tube rubbing against its support plate, wear with the tube rubbing against the anti-vibration bar, and tube rubbing against the retainer bar. So what Edison has done is a kind of shell game. Look over here at this shell, which is the tube-to-tube wear. Don't look at the thousands and thousands of tubes or indications of tubes where there is wear in other locations against support structures. And that's why they didn't want to release the data. Last Thursday, Edison came in and said, we want to start up Unit 2 because it's very much less damage than Unit 3. It's fine. Our problems are in Unit 3. And our only problem really is tube-to-tube wear. Tube-to-support structure wear we've seen commonly throughout the country. It's a common problem, and it's nothing unusual. It's just a settling in. Take a look at this quote from Edison. The nature of the support structure wear is not unusual in new steam generators and is part of the equipment settling in. Well, it might be true, right? I mean, maybe every new steam generator has thousands of indications of wear and hundreds of bad tubes. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said the same thing. And I then called them and asked, what's your source for your claim that this is standard and normal in new steam generators? And they said, it's anecdotal. I said, you're going to make a decision to restart a reactor that has 1,000 times the long-life radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb based on an anecdote? And they said, well, maybe our headquarters has some data. And they got back to me and says, no, NRC headquarters doesn't know either. They've never accumulated the data as to what happens to new steam generators. So we did. More particularly, Dora did. And this took a lot of work. Don't rock, don't rock, don't rock! She had to go through every what's called in-service inspection report for new steam generators in the country. When they put in a new steam generator, at the next refueling, they do an inspection to see what's happened. So I want you to keep in mind what Edison said. And that is the basis for their claim they can start up Unit 2. That what's going on in Unit 2 is common, it's just settling in. And the second claim they made is that what's going on in Unit 2 is vastly less of a problem than in Unit 3. Unit 3 is the problem, Unit 2 is just fine. We can start it up. So let's see what the data actually show. Here's the number of damaged tubes in Unit 2 compared to the number in Unit 3. Doesn't seem like much of a difference, right? 1,600 bad tubes in Unit 2, 1,800 in Unit 3, in round numbers. They're telling the NRC, Unit 2 is just dandy. Our problem is Unit 3. The data don't support that. So what about how it compares to the national average? First of all, they said similar steam generators have the same problem. There's only one reactor in the country that has similar steam generators, and that's the Fort Calhoun reactor. And they have Mitsubishi steam generators. Do you know how many damaged tubes they had after 2 years of operation? None. Do you know how many indications of wear? None. And how many plug tubes? None. So apparently, similar steam generators, it's not really that common to have thousands of wear indications. Well, maybe they meant by similar any steam generator that's kind of like it in the sense that it is a recirculating steam generator, which is what the vast majority of steam generators are, where the coolant goes up, goes through a U-bend, and comes down. So DORA went and tabulated this. And look at these data. The red lines are for San Onofre Unit 2 and San Onofre 3. And so what you will see is that for a lot of plants, they have 0 wear indications. They have 0 damaged tubes. They have 0 tubes that had to be plugged. That's out of thousands, by the way. Thousands and thousands of tubes. The median, meaning that half the reactors in the country have fewer and half have more, the median is 4 indications of wear on 4 tubes and no tubes plugged. That's the typical, the normal, the median for the country. Look at San Onofre. Compare that to the mean, the median. 4,721 indications of wear on 1,595 tubes, with 510 plugged. We've graphed this. And you know, we all were taught in high school to hate numbers, but I love it when I can put them into a picture. Look at that picture. Look at that picture. Red is San Onofre 2, San Onofre 3. Most of the reactors have so few indications of wear that you can't even show it on the chart. I had to make it a tall chart to be able to even get San Onofre in. Here's the number of damaged tubes nationwide. And here is the number of tubes plugged. Now, if you made a statement to a government agency applying for a driver's license and you lied, you could probably have some legal action taken against you. Edison has made a statement that is the basis of determining whether or not 8.5 million people who live within 50 miles will be placed at risk, and made statements that are clearly not true. And no action has been taken by the NRC because the NRC made the same statements based on an anecdote. And because NRC and Edison together are trying to make sure there's no evidentiary hearing where someone like me could cross-examine their witness and ask how their statement comports with the actual data. So here are fundamental conclusions. Once again, the median number of steam generators showing wear after one cycle of operation is 4. San Onofre Unit 2 had approximately 400 times the typical reactor. The median number of indications of wear on those tubes nationally is 4. San Onofre had 4,721, more than 1,000 times as many as the typical reactor. And the median number of steam generator tubes that were plugged, you plug them when they're damaged at a certain degree. The median number that had been plugged is 0 in the country. And San Onofre Unit 2 had 510 and Unit 3 807. There are more tubes plugged in each of the San Onofre reactors than in the entire country combined. So what would you do if you were a responsible utility executive, responsible nuclear engineer, and you were faced with steam generators that had failed in a year or two, were showing the signs that they weren't supposed to show for 4 decades? What would you do? You say, we're going to stop, we're going to repair them if we can, or we are going to replace them if we have to. But we're not going to drive this car with bad brakes. Brakes are failing much earlier than they should. We don't understand why. We can get them fixed. That's what you would do with a vehicle that could kill maybe 3 or 4 people. They are driving a vehicle that can produce 1 million casualties. Is that what they did on Thursday? No. On Thursday, Edison announced that it is intent on restarting Unit 2 without repairing the steam generators and without replacing them. They want to run at 70% power and hope for the best. My metaphor about the car, rather than fixing the brakes, replacing the brakes, I'll just drive at 50 miles an hour and hope that works. Oh. And they will likely get away with it because the problem that we had at Fukushima of a regulatory agency that was too cozy with the industry it was to regulate is the precise problem that most scholars of the NRC view as the case here. That it is one of the most captured, if not the most captured regulatory agency in the federal pantheon. At least 4 of the 5 commissioners were essentially chosen by the industry they are to regulate. And my own views about nuclear power might be different if the institutions were different. If the companies that are the vendors didn't try to suppress safety problems, as you'll hear perhaps in a minute from another speaker. If the NRC shut down 1 or 2 of the worst reactors, if it didn't automatically grant licenses. Do you know in the entire history of the NRC, to the best of my knowledge, and its predecessor, the Atomic Energy Commission, there has never been an application to build a nuclear reactor that has been turned down when someone contested it. Every single time someone came in and said it was unsafe, the NRC and the AEC before said, we're going to sign off anyway. One NRC commissioner famously said that we are in the business of granting licenses, not of deciding whether to grant them, but granting them. It's a rubber stamp. Most of you are a similar age to me. Do you remember the Evelyn Wood reading course? You learned how to use your fingers to be able to speed things up. And I used to boast that I got so good at it I could do it with my eyes closed. Well, the NRC can approve license applications with their eyes closed. It's a rubber stamp. Even so, Edison doesn't want to risk a hearing because some things can occur in those hearings that are embarrassing. You could put on the Edison witness and ask him to explain why he said one thing and the data shows something else. So they're resisting there being an evidentiary hearing. Let me show you one other set of numbers, give you a couple other items about San Onofre, and then let's hear from our other 2 speakers and take some questions. I like graphs, as you can tell. These, I'm sorry that the words are small, are the number of safety complaints from workers at U.S. nuclear plants in 2007 to 2011. Red is San Onofre, and blue is the average for the country. They're number 1. Last year, the year before, and the year before that, San Onofre was number 1 in the country for safety complaints to the NRC. And you have to understand the significance of this. They're complaining to the NRC because they're too scared to complain to their management. Because, look at the next chart. This is worker complaints of retaliation or harassment for raising safety concerns. They're number 1. NRC 2 years ago had to issue a chilling effects letter to Edison saying that they had created an atmosphere of intimidation at the plant so that workers were too scared to bring forward safety complaints. And by the way, in the last few weeks, Edison has announced it's going to eliminate the jobs of 1/3 of its workforce. So if they're having trouble operating safely with the current workforce, imagine how well they'll do with something like 700 fewer, 500, 600, 700 fewer workers. And also figure out who's going to get fired first. The person who raised the safety complaints, who's the person you want to keep, or the person who kept his or her mouth shut when they saw safety complaints. So let me end with a couple of other little factoids about San Onofre that make me nervous about it generally. I mentioned the backup systems and what happened to Fukushima. You need off-site power to run the pumps to keep the coolant moving to prevent melting of the fuel. And so you need off-site power lines. And if you lose those, you need backup diesel generators. Most of us who live in the San Lorenzo Valley, we lose power several times during the winter. We have a little backup generator to provide power. If we didn't, it wouldn't matter that much. We could get through a few days. But if you don't have power for a few days at a nuclear reactor, not only are you in trouble, but 8.5 million people near you might be in trouble. So they have backup diesel generators. Great. But for 4 years, the operators of San Onofre had not properly connected the batteries to the backup diesel generators. Didn't catch it for 4 years. So eventually that got caught, and then a year or two later they were trying to start up one of their backup diesels and it wouldn't start. It's okay, you have a second one. But that one was down for repairs, so they didn't have one. They had to scram the reactor. But my most favorite story is that for 5 years, hourly fire watches. What? Supposed to every hour go out and check to make sure there's not a part of the reactor burning, the reactor complex. Every hour you're supposed to do that. For 5 years, the hourly fire watches weren't done. The log documenting the fire watches was fabricated, not for a day or a week or a month, but for 5 years, without the operators, the management, the superiors supposedly catching it. And the only reason there were supposed to be fire watches in the first place was because in the 1970s, there had been a terrible fire at the Browns Ferry reactor, and they had almost lost control of the reactor. And so the NRC ordered all reactors in the country to replace wiring that could catch fire and to put in barriers so you didn't have one set of wires close to another without some kind of a barrier or distance. Edison resisted. And 3 decades later, they still haven't done it. What they told the NRC, and the NRC said fine, is we'd like to have a waiver or an extension for another year or two. But don't worry, we'll put in place compensatory measures, a lovely phrase, which simply means we'll put in place fire watches, which for 5 years they didn't do. A fire can knock out your controls so you can't cool the fuel. A earthquake, a fire, other terrorist event can take down your off-site power. If your backup diesels don't work, you have what we saw at Fukushima. In addition, San Onofre is very close to a complex of earthquake faults that the Coastal Commission and the Energy Commission say appear capable of larger and more frequent earthquakes than the reactor was designed for. Fukushima was designed for an earthquake vastly less large than what destroyed it. The same thing can occur in Southern California. So you have the perfect storm. A reactor next to an earthquake fault complex larger than the reactor was designed to withstand. And you all remember, many of you have heard me before, that I love this definition. David Brower's definition of a nuclear reactor. A nuclear reactor is a complex technological device for locating earthquake faults in California. Everywhere you build one, we find a fault. So you have a large earthquake fault complex next to it, more capable than the reactor was designed to withstand. You have the second largest population surrounding any nuclear reactor in the country, second only to Indian Point outside New York City. So the consequences of something going wrong are immense. 8.5 million people within 50 miles. You'll remember that the NRC recommended evacuating Americans 50 miles from Fukushima, but the evacuation zone in the United States from the same agency is 10 miles. And it doesn't matter, how would you evacuate Southern California anyway? You can't move without it, even without a meltdown occurring. The freeways are always jammed anyway. So you have an earthquake complex, you have a very high population nearby. You have a management structure that is broken, a safety culture that is sick, that retaliates rather than rewards complaints, that suppresses things, that lies about important safety matters and tries to cut corners. And then add on top of that, you have very crippled steam generators that have broken in a year or two when they should be capable of operating for decades, and a company that wants to start them up without fixing them, and quite literally hope for the best. And even that's not bad enough. They want to do that without a hearing and without a license amendment, and the decision to avoid a license amendment and to avoid a hearing is what got us into this mess in the first place. It's $1 billion error just on the dollars, forget the human lives. If they had gone through the license amendment process, if there had been a hearing, it is possible this issue would have been detected. NRC, after the fact, reviewed the computer model for Mitsubishi and concluded that it was wrong, that it underestimated steam flows by a factor of 400%. Well, if NRC staff can review the computer model after the steam generators were put in, they could have reviewed it before they cut holes in the containment structures, before they put these in, and before they ran them and one of the tubes burst. So they seem not to learn from history. Friends of the Earth, Natural Resource Defense Council have petitioned for a hearing, an evidentiary hearing. What would you do if you were NRC staff and Edison to show that you really were serious about looking at whether this was safe? You would say, fine. What did NRC staff and Edison do? They each individually submitted pleadings that looked as though they had been written by the same entity, or that the NRC staff was behaving as though they were co-counsel with the utility they were to regulate, and which they argued that there should be no hearing. You know why? Because NRDC and Friends of the Earth had not filed their request for a hearing electronically. Now you have to understand that the lawyers for Friends of the Earth had contacted NRC staff and asked for the access code to the electronic system so they could file electronically. NRC staff refused to give them the code, and then argues that they should not be permitted the hearing because they hadn't used the code that the NRC staff wouldn't give them. I mean, Kafka, there are job openings at NRC, but I think they've been already filled with some of Kafka's siblings. So you laugh at it, but it's very serious, because if they get the permission to restart, and there's nothing right now to stop it, Region 4 of NRC will take a few weeks to a few months to pretend to review this. They'll send 2 or 3 sets of questions, and then they will grant the request. They may attach 1 or 2 trivial conditions to make it look like they've done something. But that plant will restart, and it may be okay. I mean, it ran for 22 months and was getting some damage. Running for an additional 5 is an increment above that, and then another increment, and another increment. You know the old story. You walk halfway to the wall, and halfway to the wall, and halfway, and never get there. They're only looking at tiny increments of additional use, not looking at, hey, can we run this thing long term, with tubes that are wearing down so quickly, and there's already damaged goods. So the question is, what can be done to change that so there is a process that is honest? And the only answer I can give you in closing is that an informed citizenry can make a difference. We've seen this many, many times before. Senator Boxer chairs the Oversight Committee for the NRC. Senator Feinstein chairs the Appropriations Subcommittee for NRC. And Jerry Brown has the power to say to the Public Utilities Commission and the Energy Commission, no. None of those things are happening quite yet. And that is because, in part, of the power of utilities, and part because there is not sufficient voice from the public to make the political figures listen. You all remember that, politicians, even those who have substantial ethical cores, in some sense are also trying to figure out which way the wind blows. And that tells us that we must be a force that is showing where that wind is. In the absence of it, San Onofre will start up. It'll run for 5 months, and maybe something will happen and maybe won't. They'll shut down for a little bit, look at it, and there'll be very minimal, not minimal, but marginal difference to run for 5 months compared to the previous 20, so there's not going to be much to see anyway. They'll start up for a longer period, and maybe they can limp along for a couple years that way. Or maybe a bunch of tubes start to burst, and those tubes bursting propagate, and those propagate, and we have a major problem. Or there's an earthquake that occurs at a time when you have weakened steam generator tubes. Remember, they're already very thin. Now they've been thinned further. So I'll take some questions. We'll have some discussion. But first, I want to have Dora tell you about her detective work, and then Dale tell you what this means in the bigger picture.